Good afternoon. My presentation today is on the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and I've chosen the title Self-Defeating Practices by Nation States of the Southern African Development Community. The phrase self-defeating practices in my title is not meant to disparage African countries, but it's just an emphasis of the truism in international relations that states, because of the nature of the system, tend to engage in self-defeating practices. This is how my discussion is going to be structured. First of all, I will explain to you why I chose SADC, what's my motivation and what's the relevance of SADC in the international arena. Then I will turn to how other people have approached the study of SADC, which will be a literature review on my part. And because the literature that I read for this purpose is actually quite vast, and in its own right, the topics I read are self-contained units. I'll just try to say one sentence that captures the essence of each literature I will look at on this presentation. Thirdly, I'll then turn to my approach, how I chose to study SADC. I use theories of integration. I'll explain those to you in that section. And for the fourth part of my discussion, I'll talk about the genealogy of SADC, because it is important to look at the history of any organization, since history tends to have an effect on contemporary practice of any organization. Then the main part of my discussion is the self-defeating practices of SADC. Here it's just me listing the opportunities and mostly the challenges that SADC face. I will try to disambiguate these in terms of whether they are systemic or is it because the actors are actually poor. So I'll try to sort of explain to you who I think is responsible for these challenges. I'll then turn to my conclusion, which is basically asking the question, what is the SADC idea? In an earlier presentation, I was asked whether we would miss SADC if it were to disappear today. In this section, I'll try to answer that question. So without further ado, I will, basically, first of all, let me just show you what SADC is. This is the nation states of the Southern African Development Community. Angola, Botswana, DRC, my own country, Zimbabwe, and South Africa is in there as well. There are 15 nation states of this regional economic grouping. So let's get into the actual presentation now, starting with my motivation for studying SADC. My own field myself is defense and security. So I wanted to understand whether SADC can create an effective mutual defense pact. This is a superstructural issue. So in trying to understand this superstructural issue, I was forced to look at the foundation, which is economics. So I was forced to look at the foundational principles of SADC, which is economics and political cohesion. So my look at SADC, my motivation for trying to understand SADC is I want to know more about the superstructural issue, defense and security, and to understand that I had to go to the foundation, which is why was SADC founded, what are the imperatives driving SADC, and what are the practices that are endorsed that are in the SADC treaty. That's my motivation. I want to understand about defense and security, but I gotta look at the whole organization so as to be able to understand how it fits into the greater scheme of things. And in terms of relevance in the world, studying SADC is just looking at the new building blocks of the international relations system. In SADC's case, you can just formulate it as SADC fitting into the African Union, AU, which feeds into the United Nations, the bigger organization. So SADC is actually recognized in international law under Chapter 8 of the United Nations, which emphasizes that regional economic groupings can be the first port of call for solving problems that exist in their own section. That's my motivation and what I think is relevance for SADC. SADC is headquartered in Botswana, Gaborone, and now turning to my literature review, what others have said about SADC. First of all, I looked at NSB Haas, who is like the preeminent theorist on regional integration. His work just helped me to understand the parameters that you need to stay within to understand regional integration. His work focuses you on what's important. For instance, part of his work, he says that what yardstick is there for choosing and justifying ways to explain the arrival of various degrees of regional unity. He then says one extreme is to list every conceivable variable, from the length of the shoreline of the member nations to the proportion of the national budget devoted to veterans' pensions, which is to say, he is actually teaching us to just choose variables that are most relevant. So he then says that such a generous and comprehensive approach really implies that we do not know enough on the basis of common sense and immersion in the factual details of regional integration to select variables more economically. So his work helped me to select the most useful and relevant variables for studying regional integration in Southern Africa. I then looked at Andrew Axline, Underdevelopment, Dependency, and Integration. The most important thing from this document was that he says that regional integration in underdeveloped countries or in underdeveloped conditions tends to be self-defeating, in that you are doing regional integration, but you actually create worse conditions than if you had not integrated, because you then get trade diversion and polarization, whereby integration creates winners and losers. So understanding this then means that you then look for ways of mitigating the adverse effects of regional integration. That's what I took from Andrew Axline's work. Looked at Rita Abramson's Development Policy and the Democratic Peace Thesis in Sub-Saharan Africa. Rita Abramson just highlights this problem that we all know of. For instance, most countries that underwent IMF-administered economic structural adjustment programs understand that those structural adjustment programs actually created conditions of poverty, worsened the situation in the countries that they were administered. So the value of Rita Abramson's work for my study is that you then know that the actions of outsiders, the actions of the first world, actually impacts on regional integration in Southern Africa. Another work which is more specific to SADC was by Takawira Msawengana, who talks about the SADC Parliament. His point of view is just to ask whether, if a parliament were to be instituted with powers, as in domestic politics, would it be able then to upload preferences of the populace into the SADC executive, such that SADC becomes a truly representative body, which represents the people, not just the executives. And another work I read on the same topic was Anne Hammersted's Securitization from Below. This looks at the relationship between South Africa's foreign policy, immigration policy, and Zimbabwe, and the situation in Zimbabwe. The takeaway point from this is that even if we think that SADC populations are not represented in SADC, you will find that the population's actions might actually force the executives, the leaders of the countries, to change their behavior or to take them on board. In South Africa's case, there was the xenophobic violences in 2008, which made South African authorities realize that they had an immigration problem, even though the preferences would have been to just sort of ignore the immigration problem. So that's basically the works that I looked at. I looked at actually more works than this, but I think these 5 show what insights I took from different works into my project. So coming to my own approach, I used the theories of regional integration, and I chose 2 theories. And the reason why I chose these 2 theories was because they fall in separate camps, in opposing camps of the debate. The first theory falls in the supranationalism camp of the debate on integration. This supranationalism camp just assumes that states are being subsumed into a federal or federal-like union. That it presupposes automaticity to integration, whereas the opposition camp, intergovernmentalism, states that states always have the freedom of choice on whether to integrate or not. So it says there's no automaticity to integration. States always use that to their advantage. I'll talk about that in a few moments. Let's just look first of all at the definitions of integration, which also sheds light on how the theories then would apply to integration. The dictionary meaning just means combining 2 parts to make a unified whole. But I think NSB's definition and Karl Dosch's definitions are better and more pertinent to my discussion. NSB's definition is one that emphasizes political integration, where countries will then shift their loyalties to a new center. That's just basically that. If we use SADC as our example, politicians in Zimbabwe, politicians in Malawi and Zambia, instead of doing things that benefit strictly their individual countries, whatever they do will be standing above their country interests, but will then be aimed at what benefits the whole region. That's what integration implies for NSB has. For Karl Dosch, he says the relationship among units in which they are mutually interdependent and jointly produce system properties which they would separately lack. This is pertinent, especially for SADC, because in conditions of underdevelopment, you do not have a large market and you do not have a strong manufacturing base. So the expectation is that once you join your units, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Namibia join together, you've got a larger market, you've got a larger manufacturing base. That's the theory. But the practice then, as I will mention in my in the self-defeating practice section, shows that even though you do that, you may not always get the best result. You might actually get an opposite effect of what you are intending. But in terms of definition, the hope for SADC is that by joining together, you are creating a stronger bloc which has got more options than your countries individually. Now, the theory is proper. So the first theory that I said stands in the supranationalism camp is neo-functionalism. Neo-functionalism just presupposes that there will be a success in a limited technical area, like coordination of railway timetables. And once you've succeeded in coordinating that railway timetable, then you might actually agree to coordinate as well airline timetables. And this keeps creating spillover effects where over a long time, a lot of your processes, a lot of your actions are coordinated at the supranational level. And in the end, this creates trust, which ends up having an effect whereby even in high politics like defense, cooperation in trade, in foreign policy, you actually decide to work together, to coordinate it together. This process is actually a conscious process. It is a goal that you are aiming at. So neo-functionalism presupposes that this is the path that integration takes. But it is opposed by intergovernmentalism, which says international organizations are epiphenomenal to state power. The only time that an international organization is allowed to exist is if it benefits states who negotiate and bargain to their advantage always. So intergovernmentalism says states only allow international organizations like SADC, like United Nations, to make decisions on their behalf if those decisions benefit those states. And in my study, I realized that intergovernmentalism actually is closer to the truth in SADC than neo-functionalism, because everything in SADC seems to be executive controlled. The governments retain control in every aspect of integration. But why is this? Why is it like this? And it's not necessarily a bad thing that the governments control this. The one thing that I can really explain why the situation exists in SADC, where SADC falls in the intergovernmentalism camp and the neo-functionalism, is the history of SADC. So in the genealogy of SADC, we find that SADC was formed. Actually, SADC went through these processes where initially it was the frontline states, which operated from 1974 to 1994. And if you look behind me, I've got the years that each and individual country joined this organization, the frontline states. And the imperative for the frontline states was to liberate Southern Africa from colonial rule. And so how SADC operated then, they were trying to attain sovereignty for the black majorities in Southern Africa who had been denied sovereignty. So it then, because I mentioned earlier that the history of an organization always impinges on how it operates in the contemporary world. So because SADC was formed to achieve sovereignty for these peoples, when they achieved sovereignty, it would mean as well that once they achieve it, they would guard it jealously. They would guard sovereignty jealously because it's something that they went to struggle for, that they were denied for a long time. So initially SADC was the frontline states, 1974 to 1994, and as each country got independent and joined it, SADC decided to have an economic cooperation platform. Because frontline states was about gaining independence, political independence, but as they gained independence, they decided to form an economic platform so that their political independence also is mirrored by economic independence. And SADC, the Southern African Development Coordination Conference, was formed in 1980 and lasted until 1992. And this platform was to remove dependence on South Africa and eventually remove dependence on the West in the economic field as countries gain their independence. And as South Africa gained its independence, when the goals of liberating Southern Africa became realized, Southern Africa then turned to change from Southern African Development Coordination Conference to a Southern African Development Community from 17 August 1992. And the specific aim now was to eschew dependency on the Western countries. But the other operations of loose coordination, respect for sovereignty were enshrined in the treaty, and sovereignty was retained in SADC. So that's a brief history of SADC. Coming to the practices that I think have the challenges for SADC, I have characterized this as the main one I've said is classical sovereignty. That's what I've said, that's the main challenge, where because states revere their sovereignty, they cannot, this then means that it results in things like nationalist rivalry. It results in incompatible political and economic systems. It results in multiple membership to regional economic communities, because if you are a sovereign state, no one can tell you to just belong to one regional economic community. You could belong to 10 economic communities, and that's sovereignty for you. And therefore then there is no enforcement of rules because of the sovereignty of nations. Like I mentioned earlier in the discussion, unjust economic structures also play a part in in SADC being unable to perform as an optimal organization. But yes, so SADC, if I just look back briefly, just to sum up the points in the first, SADC is a regional economic grouping on the African continent, which aims at achieving economic improvement for its nationals, development, security, and political cohesion across the board. So, in fact, let me, in lieu of a conclusion, let me ask the question then, what is the SADC idea? SADC is a sub-regional organization whose main aim is economic development and integration for member states. It is an attempt to integrate the economic and political domains. The theories of integration I looked at shed light on the nature of integration, but I think SADC falls in the intergovernmentalism camp, whereby everything is executive decided, rests on the executives of each country. This then means what we have in SADC is a reverence for classical sovereignty, which is held as sacrosanct, and it has implications for integration. I think it retards integration, but that's a separate study altogether. The challenges then, when I looked at SADC, are largely systemic, but I have not resolved the age-old structure agency debate. So, in looking at SADC, I found that the challenges are more than the opportunities, and sovereignty is the most potent of these challenges. Then, for going forward, my further study then will be to recommend a path which will bring SADC to this position of adhering to what Robert S. McNamara said in the 1960s, that security and development are two sides of the same coin. This is the superstructural issue that I want to discuss based on the foundational principles I've tried to outline. I hope you've followed what I've tried to say, because it's really clear in my head, but sometimes disseminating information is not as straightforward as you think it would be. Thank you.